This is the future. San Dimas, California, 2692. A most excellent society based on the philosophy of the two great ones, Bill and Ted, and the music of their band, the Wild Stallions. My job is to provide the two great ones with the Circuits of Time phone booth, allowing them to travel through time, keeping them on their correct path. A path they must follow to ensure the future of our most excellent society. Society based on the philosophy and lessons learned during Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures.
Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is a review of the 1992 live-action sitcom adaptation, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures. Now, this show has the reputation of being one of the most bogus, non-triumphant, terrible adaptations known to man. And I gotta be honest, when I first saw a couple episodes when I was younger, I agreed with every criticism that this show got at the time and was still getting. I thought it was crappy. I thought it was the epitome of just lame with a capital L. I thought it was just an awful show. And I just felt that it deserved to be forgotten and lost throughout the circuits of time. But I revisited it because I've been in a Bill and Ted mood, and I really wanted to give it more of a fair shot. And I was pleasantly surprised by how much I didn't hate it. I still wouldn't necessarily say that the show is good. I think the show is still honestly pretty lame. It definitely pales in comparison to the first two films in terms of the quality of the writing, the performances, production values, art direction, pretty much everything that you can think of. But despite that, I don't think it's a complete failure. I think there are elements of the show that are genuinely creative. I think there are things about it that weren't really that poorly handled. I feel that Evan Richards and Christopher Kennedy, they actually did a good job playing facsimiles of Bill and Ted. They're the closest that I've seen to really capture that dopey, lovable quality of the two characters, and essentially be lesser versions of Keanu and Alex, but not in a way where it seems like they are just poor. Really just piss poor takes on these characters and their personalities. I felt that Richards and Kennedy actually did a good job recreating those personalities to the best of their abilities, and I thought that they were actually a bright spot in this otherwise pretty inconsistent show when it comes to its overall quality. This is one of those shows that, to me, the hit ratio is really low. The best episodes are average. The worst episodes are below average. There really wasn't an episode where I hated watching it. Like, it was just unwatchable trash. So I will give the show that. But that's not a very high bar. There were only like 2 or 3 episodes that I would say that I liked okay as time wasters. The other episodes were just forgettable and really just seemed like the epitome of filler. And that's really what this show is anyway. This show is Bill and Ted filler. It wasn't really needed. It didn't expand the canon. It didn't really do anything in terms of carrying the story further along, which I think that's a big reason why it failed. It's because a lot of fans of the first 2 films, when this premiered, they were expecting it to actually carry on the canon from the first 2 films. And what they got was just a show that just was, in essence, a reboot of Bill and Ted. And they weren't fans of that, especially when they didn't have Keanu and Alex involved. or George Carlin. They didn't have anybody who was a part of the first two films involved with the show. So when you don't have that connection, you lose the authenticity. And I think as a result, they lost the audience right from the moment the first episode aired. It was just one of those things that was like, why is this a thing? Why do we need this? We already had a Bill and Ted cartoon. Keanu Reeves and Alex Winter actually did come back, and they did voices for it, along with George Carlin. And this has the same name as that show. Why do we need another Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures? We like the cartoon. And then on top of that, people probably got bad tastes in their mouth too, because I don't know if the second season of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures, the cartoon, aired before this or around the same time. But if they were, if that aired before this, that didn't help either, because that show sucked. That was even more bogus and heinous than the worst episode of this show, and I can see why fans would be very leery of this, because the same guys who voiced Bill and Ted in that cartoon were Bill and Ted in this show. This show is ultimately an interesting failure of an experiment because of the writing. The writing is shoddy, it's substandard, it's completely inconsistent in terms of its overall quality. The humor is mostly miss. I can't really think of there was a fun little Schwarzenegger reference. There's a moment where Bill and Ted need to tune their guitars, their air guitars. That was clever. There's a few other moments that are a little that'll elicit a little bit of a chuckle or maybe make you smirk, but those are very few and far between. Most of the humor is very lame, very forgettable, and honestly pretty lazy and uninspired. The smartest the humor gets, I would say, is in episode 2, where they're doing a satire of soap operas, but you're only really going to get a lot of that if you're familiar with soap operas and a lot of the tropes in soap operas. If you're not really going to get the same kind of humorous experience as you would if you were somewhat familiar with that stuff. And the episode where they deal with an alternate dark timeline in the vein of alternate 1985 and Back to the Future Part 2. But for the most part, the humor is along the same lines as the cartoon, which wasn't really that great. So that doesn't do the show any favors. Creativity-wise, when they do things different, when they really think outside of the phone booth, and Bill and Ted, like in the unaired pilot, they go inside the comic book world of a true crime comic. That's actually pretty ingenious and interesting. When they go inside the television and go through the different channels and go inside a soap opera, that was intriguing and had a lot of moments where it actually was fairly well thought out, and the script was interesting and had some fun. The alternate timeline episode where you get to see Bill and Ted in a different future, where Bill is a corporate thug, he's a cutthroat corporate shark, and Ted is an undercover police officer who's more infatuated with getting people busted than anything else, doesn't care about their lives or ruining things for them. He just wants something to put on his tally so he can move up and can go into the FBI. And Bill and Ted are mortal enemies, and that's something that I think a lot of fans didn't like, because that was not really what Bill and Ted were. But I liked that episode because it was something different, and it actually kind of made the show and its existence feel like there was a point to it. But then you get episodes like Destiny Babes, which do have some of the more clever gags, like the air guitar bit where they're tuning their air guitars, but it feels like pointless filler, because they go in and use the phone booth to get the greatest womanizer and lover alive in Casanova to teach them how to be better at getting chicks, and the only lesson they get is to be themselves, and they be themselves really well and get their supposed Destiny Babes, which aren't the princesses, because for some reason the show decides to act like they aren't even around, and that never really happened. And so none of this really matters anyway. It just feels like a super filler episode, because by the end of the episode, Bill and Ted get their Destiny Babes. They go on a date, but the Destiny Babes don't give a shit about them. They're more focused on talking about a polka dot dress than anything. And it's pointless. Bill and Ted were themselves. Didn't really lead to anything because the date went nowhere. And they're like, well, maybe our Destiny Babes are somewhere else. And then that's it. You're like, why did you retcon the princesses out when they don't even get these Destiny Babes? What was the point? Might as well just had the princesses in the story. It would have been nice to have seen the princesses in this show, to be perfectly honest, because you could have had them as students at San Dimas High with Bill and Ted, and you could have had some stories involving them, and you could have had more character development for the princesses. There really isn't a lot other than the comic books. So this was a prime opportunity for that, and they wasted it with filler episodes like Destiny Babes. There's another one where Bill and Ted go back in time to try to see why Ted's mom doesn't like this girl who I think is their music teacher, and it's a predictable results because it's dealing with the 60s and the whole peace and love movement or whatever, and that episode was filler. Even though it had a good message and a nice heart to it, it still was just complete total filler. And the last episode, like, even the writers admitted they didn't even know what they were doing. They were like, we didn't even know what we were going to do with the Einstein episode. Like, when you were saying things like that while you're writing a show, maybe you shouldn't make the show. Or maybe you should take a little bit extra time to do the show. Apparently, Alex Winter, in an interview, he said he would have been more involved with the show if they asked him to be, but they never thought to ask Alex to be involved with the Bill and Ted show. Why? I have no fucking idea. Would it have been better? I think it honestly would have been a little bit better with Alex's involvement, at least from a conceptual standpoint, at least from somebody who could be another voice in the room, another guy to be like, who has experience in the franchise, and be a guy who could be like, hey, we shouldn't really go there. We shouldn't do that. We should do this instead. We should definitely have the princesses involved. Stuff like that would happen if, Alex was involved with the show. But that being said, I think even if Alex was involved creatively, you needed to have different writers. You needed to have a whole overhaul of a lot of different things with the show in order to make it somewhat excellent, let alone a great show. And I feel that I don't think it really had the ability to be a great show in the first place because of the fact that Keanu and Alex aren't involved, Carlin isn't involved, and it's not even a continuation of Bill and Ted. It's just a reboot. So then it makes it feel even more like a cheap knockoff. And that's not really what you want out of a Bill and Ted show. You don't want to watch a Bill and Ted show and feel like you're watching an imitation of Bill and Ted. And that's really what you got. And it made Evan Richards and Christopher Kennedy's roles and their performances, it put them under an even bigger microscope, because now it's blatantly obvious that they're just imitations, because the show around them is an imitation. And I feel that they really should have done a better job making it. If they were going to do their own thing, they really should have done a better job making it their own thing. And they have moments like that with the soap opera episode and the bits of the unaired pilot and the alternate future timeline one. But there's not enough of them. I really feel that they should have gone the route of USA Network's Weird Science show, which I honestly think that's a great show. I really like that show. I think it's underrated. I even like the actors who play Gary and the other kid better than the actors in Weird Science. I think part of that might just be because I grew up with the show more than I grew up with the movie. But I still feel that they do a really good job, or at least on the same level as the original actors from Weird Science. I can't really say the same about Evan Richards and Christopher Kennedy here, but they're a step below, but they're not like multiple steps below. I think they're close, and they're close enough to Keanu and Alex. And that honestly is one of the things that has surprised me the most about this show. Another one is I had no idea Lisa Wilcox was involved with this show. And I'm a huge fan of Lisa Wilcox. I loved her in Nightmare 4. And if you like Lisa Wilcox, I would recommend watching at least the second episode of this show, because she's a total babe in this. And she was a total babe, period. But it's really a lot of fun to see her flex her muscles and to strut her stuff when it comes to playing Missy. And I thought she really filled the shoes of Missy very well. Now, when I talk about this show, one of the main things that comes to mind, other than the imitation stuff, which, speaking of that, might as well bring up Rick Overton as Rufus. Rick Overton as Rufus, he was pretty... I'm trying to... It wasn't necessarily terrible or awful. He was just there. I think Rick Overton either wasn't the right guy for the role, or Rick Overton really did not need to be chained to Rufus. If you don't have George Carlin, don't do Rufus. You're already doing Bill and Ted without Keanu and Alex. You don't need to also have Rufus be played by a different guy. We don't really need to do that. So I think it would have benefited the show to have Rick Overton, if you're going to have him in this kind of role, play a completely different character, and have the character act in a way that's different, because it just comes across as a half-assed ripoff of Rufus that's nowhere near as cool, and that just hurts the show, and it hurts Rick Overton, because it's not fair to him, because he's just shackled to this, I gotta be as much like George Carlin as I possibly can, and no one can really be George Carlin other than George Carlin. And what I find interesting is that with Missy and with Ted's dad, which this, like I said, it doesn't really... It's a show that is its own show. It's not... doesn't apply to or follow the canon of the first two films. Because Bill and Ted have not even played at the Battle of the Bands yet. They're still in high school. They're still trying to figure things out. Missy is still married to Bill's dad. So Bill's dad, Mr. Preston, is played by Don Lake. And I felt that Mr. Preston and Missy Preston, and even Captain Logan and his wife, which you actually got to see Ted's mom more, which was nice to see. There's more for them to do, and there's more for them to build their own characters. Where Rick Overton wasn't really able to do that because of the overall structure and the approach that this show was taking with the characters and the characterizations. What I find kind of crazy about this show is that the original origins of the show were very different from what it ultimately became. Apparently, Keanu and Alex initially didn't want anything to do with the show because they were pitched an idea that was like Porky's meets Bill and Ted. And I can totally see why Keanu and Alex were like, no way! Because they're just like, nope, not going to do that. That was a very short-lived idea and concept, because that didn't get very far, clearly. So Clifton Campbell was brought on board, and he came up with the concept of the show, which eventually was made. What's also crazy about this show is that it was originally intended to coincide with the release of Bogus Journey, but for some reason that didn't happen, and the producers of the show were waiting until Bogus Journey made a certain amount of money, so then they don't just release a Bill and Ted show that nobody cared about, which is funny, because that's ultimately what the show was anyway. So they waited their time until a year after Bogus Journey to release this show that has no connection to Bogus Journey whatsoever, So all they did is just piss off people who were fans of Bogus Journey and Excellent Adventure, which were the core audience they were trying to attract. Kind of killed the chances of really making Bill and Ted be a thriving franchise on television. So that wasn't really a wise move on their part. The show actually has a decent intro. I thought the intro for the show actually had a catchy theme by Nathan Wang, who was the composer for the show. Starts off on a decent foot. And when it comes to the episodes, like I said, the quality of them is very inconsistent. A lot of them are below average. Some of them are average. None of them are above average or great. And speaking of the episodes, might as well just start talking about the episodes. So the first episode of the show is actually the pilot, the unaired pilot. The title of this pilot is completely unknown. Part of the story was written by Savage Steve Holland. The name might ring a bell. He's worked on a good amount of things. And this one involved a plot where Bill and Ted, they need a new amp because they blew it while practicing in the garage, and they don't have enough money, so they decide to apply for a job at Nail World. This is one reoccurring plot thread throughout this series I don't care for. Bill and Ted getting a job is bogus. Nobody wants to see Bill and Ted working at a retail store, at Nail World. Nobody gives a fuck about that. Nobody gives a shit. Fans didn't care. It's not a direction or an extra thing for Bill and Ted that really adds anything to the canon or to these characters. It also leads to this annoying, irritating character, Mr. Coulson, who becomes very, very prominent in this series and is like another mentor for Bill and Ted. You already have Rufus in this show. Why do you need another mentor for Bill and Ted? Especially one as nerdy and annoying as Mr. Coulson. I don't buy that Bill and Ted would be mentored by this guy. This guy's the epitome of lame and square and just a really irritating, nerdy stereotype and caricature. The kind that I've always hated. I hate this... Oh, I'm Mr. Coulson. I'm a nerdy loser. I'm the manager at Nail World, and I'm spineless, and I have no fucking balls. You know, I hate these fucking characters. They're completely inauthentic. They all come across as if they're just doing bad parodies or imitations of Jerry Lewis. And I've just never liked these type of characters. I mean, nothing against the actor who plays Mr. Coulson, Danny Breen. This is the role that he was asked to do, and he did a good job playing this nerdy, dickless guy, but I don't really... But that doesn't mean that it's a character that I particularly liked. And a lot of these episodes have him featured very prominently in the story, and I hated this character. Just very corny. Just the epitome of cornball. And just, you know, you want to call it cheesy? Yeah, that's cheesy for sure. So, yeah, Mr. Coulson, their nerdy manager. Well, initially... they get chased off by him in this pilot because they don't agree to take his daughter to the dance because they think she's a dog. That's one of many dark things and kind of shady stuff in this pilot episode. I can see why this wasn't picked up because it doesn't really fit with the tone of the Bill and Ted films or their whole universe. Bill and Ted are not going to be the guys to say that, you know, a certain girl is a dog and they're not going to date her because she's ugly. That's not the kind of thing that they're going to do. Also, Rufus would never say, life was a bitch for Bill and Ted. Like, he would never say that. So there's a lot of tonal stuff in this pilot that just doesn't fit. I mean, there's some creepy stuff too. Like, there's a scene where Bill is asked by his mom, Missy, to put lotion on her legs, and it's really... incesty, or is that the right word? It's just really creepy. It really is. It's no longer funny awkward. It's just creepy awkward. And they had a different actress play Missy in this. I think IMDb says that the actress who plays Missy is maybe Kimberly Cates, who was actually in Excellent Adventure as Princess Elizabeth. I don't know for sure though, but if that's the case, that's interesting. But yeah, they have a different actress play Missy than Lisa Wilcox, who would take the role in the actual aired first episode of the show. But what I like about this pilot is the creativity. Bill and Ted, they get chased off by Mr. Keelson because they don't want to date his daughter, and he tosses this comic book he's been reading at them, and they use the comic to fix their time machine because the antenna got broken, and as a result they end up being transported into the comic book, which is a black and white film noir Sin City before Sin City universe. And I thought it was really cool, and the way that they did it was inventive and creative. Bill and Ted land their phone booth on top of this guy who's shooting at this dame, and they crush him flat like a cart, like the stuff in Who Framed Roger Rabbit when a cartoon gets smashed and it's like flat. But in this case, it's flat like they're actually made out of paper and they really are 2D. I thought that was pretty inventive and cool. And they wind up taking this black and white comic dame to present day, and they did a good job showing her in black and white while everything around her is in color. She forms a relationship with Missy. Missy then feels bad for her because she lost her boyfriend. She was killed by one of the guys, in the comic book universe. And Missy sends her off in a cab to go on vacation to find herself and find a better life and get over things and have some time to herself. And all the while, there's this thing going on in the comic where Bill and Ted need to find a way to get her back into the comic world because her husband is actually still alive. But if she doesn't get back into the comic world in time, her husband's going to die for real. So the episode ends on a cliffhanger. And I thought this pilot episode was way more interesting and way better than the one that they went with. So it was honestly pretty disappointing. I could see why they didn't go with it because of the tone. Just reshoot it with a different tone and with some things tweaked with the writing. And I think that you'd have a pretty cool story. And it was a nice inventive kind of direction to take the Bill and Ted franchise. But instead they just do time travel again. But this time they travel to the time of medieval England, and then you have Mr. Keelson take center stage in the story, and that's just a net negative right from the very beginning. So yeah, you have no idea. I don't even know if the second part of the pilot was ever filmed. Another thing about this pilot is that Bill and Ted kind of look different. They would look a lot better in the show. Especially Christopher Kennedy. In the pilot episode, you can really tell that he's kind of starting to bald, and his hair is thinning on top, so it looks really off. Thankfully, in the later episodes of the show, they put a wig on him or something, or had him get a haircut or something that made it look way better. And the wardrobe was changed a little bit. Although the wardrobe was still kind of a problem. I mean, for some reason, Ted is wearing like fucking tie-dye and a vest, and doesn't really seem like anything that I would honestly see Ted wear. It's a minor nitpick, but it is something you notice more, for sure. Episode 1 is Nail the Conquering Hero. This one's written by Clifton Campbell. It's directed by Christopher T. Welch. Andy Tennant directed the pilot. He would go on to direct a few more episodes. The direction in this show is another thing that is inconsistent in terms of quality. There's a lot of times where an episode just looks very flat. It feels very flat. It's one of those shows that, due to the direction and the limitations of the production, really does feel every bit of its cheap budget, and it's very glaring and obvious. But then there's other episodes where they kind of try to do some more ambitious kind of shots and so on and so forth, and make it feel a little bit cinematic. It's understandable that it's really not going to ever feel fully cinematic because it's a low budget show, but you kind of want to at least make the attempt in a show like this, especially a high concept show, to try a little bit harder than your average, sitcom. But that doesn't happen as often as I honestly feel it should have with this show. So Nail the Conquering Hero deals with Mr. Keelson. Bill and Ted come up with this thing on the fly where they build a castle out of water sealant, and Mr. Keelson's boss comes in and he loves it, and Mr. Keelson takes credit for it, and then he winds up in the phone booth and he dials a number and he winds up in the time of King Arthur. And King Arthur in this is portrayed as a guy who's kind of a coward, so he pulls the sword out of the stone, but then he can't handle it, so then he gives it to Mr. Keelson. So the whole joke is that Mr. Keelson is now the king of the Round Table. And it goes about as well as you'd think. And so now Bill and Ted, they have to get the sword. They have to get the sword and the royal throne to the rightful heir in Arthur. And they eventually do, and Mr. Keelson learns not to take so much credit or to take credit for things that he didn't do. And lessons are learned, and that's it. Diedrich Bader plays King Arthur in this, and he's fine. But this episode was lame. I didn't find it funny. I didn't find it particularly that enjoyable. I just wasn't really that into it at all. Episode 2, this is when the show starts to get better. This one is written by Clifton Campbell. Christopher T. Welch also directed this episode. Forgive me real quick. I'm just going to get a drink. Because my throat is most heinously dry. Probably because all this fucking smoke over here where I'm at. So yeah, Christopher T. Welch directed this episode. This one really gets the closest to capturing the chaotic energy of the first two films. Missy, she doesn't want to do her wifely duties anymore because her favorite soap opera has a subplot where this guy that she's really in love with and really likes this character and has a crush on him is going to get a sex change and going to break off a relationship with this other girl in the show. This episode, while it is clever in terms of its satire of soap opera themes and tropes, it's kind of got an insidious kind of thing going on. Like, oh, Missy, she needs to be a stereotypical, dumb, useless wife character who is only there to dote to her husband and make him sandwiches and be happy and have that one little bit of happiness with her soap opera. And if she doesn't have her soap opera and it's not something that she's into anymore, she's miserable and doesn't want to make lunch and doesn't want to do all these things. And I'm like, that's honestly kind of shitty. It's kind of a shitty message. And honestly pretty misogynistic in a lot of ways, even more so than anything in any of the films. That being said, if you can get past that and also how they bumble the whole transgender thing with the character in the soap opera, there was some fun to be had with this one. I think it's a fun concept and a decent idea of having Bill and Ted go inside the television. There's a fun little gag where they are inside the TV while their dad is flipping through channels, and one of them is Max Headroom. So then they start all acting like Max Headroom. So that was kind of fun, and So there's a lot of there's a decent amount of stuff in that. Episode 3, though, I think is the best episode. It's called "It's a Totally Wonderful Life." It's a take on "It's a Wonderful Life," where there's a different alternate timeline, and Bill and Ted encounter it. Uh, this involves a blunder where Rufus puts the two great ones' futures in jeopardy, and when Ted gets sent to military school, and then the two great ones end up going their separate ways. Bill becomes a money-hungry corporate shark, and Ted turns into an overzealous, unscrupulous cop who the only thing he cares about is the next tally on his resume, and they become mortal enemies. And this is creating an alternate timeline in the future where rock music is outlawed and so on and so forth. And it was actually quite intriguing and interesting to see this alternate timeline, some sort of stuff. And I thought that Evan Richards and Christopher Kennedy did a great job playing these different versions of Bill and Ted. And I thought it was a good message to show Bill and Ted, like, hey, you guys need to stay together. You need to not let something as petty as an error on a plaque really break you two apart and really turn you into these guys, these bogus versions of yourselves, and do whatever you can to make sure this future doesn't ever become a reality. That being said, I think this episode relied too much on the Chicken Kiev jokes. I guess it's funny because Chicken Kiev sounds funny. So I thought they really over-relied upon that way too much. Kind of beat that dead horse and then beat it some more. But that being said, it's the most interesting and well put together episode. The next one's Hunka Hunka Bill and Ted. This one is directed by Christopher Tabori, written by Steve Hollander and Paul Birnbaum. This one deals with Bill and Ted meeting Elvis. And out of the historical episodes, this is the best one because the stuff with Elvis was fun. The choreography with the Elvis scenes was really well done with the dance numbers and everything. I thought Todd McDermott actually did a good job playing young Elvis. And that one I could deal with. It's not great by any means. It wasn't particularly that funny or particularly nearly as interesting or as clever as It's a Totally Wonderful Life, despite the whole thing with Chicken Kiev. It still was moderately enjoyable. It was definitely one of the more average episodes of the series. Then he had Destiny Babes, which is episode 5. I like the performance by the actor who plays Casanova, but I'm not really that big into the episode. Other than a few clever things like Bill and Ted tuning their air guitars and a reference to Schwarzenegger and stuff like that, I don't really care for it because it feels like complete and utter filler. Nothing really happens. Nothing of note ever really occurs because nothing really ever sticks in terms of the story or the plot. But I will give some credit to the actor Joe Marinelli for his performance as Casanova. He was having fun, and I had fun with his portrayal of Casanova. He was the best part of that episode, other than the other things that I've already mentioned. Episode 6 is Deja Vu. This one is directed by David Nutter. Features a screenplay by Clifton Campbell and Bruce Kirschbaum. This one deals with Ted trying, and along with Bill, going back in time to the 60s to see why their music teacher has such animosity towards his mom. And then he finds out that his father wasn't this really I'm trying to think the right word, because his father's talking about things like, oh, I was an A student, I did all these things, I wasn't a flake like you were, or worm, and you need to grow up, Ted. But in reality, his dad was totally infatuated with their music teacher when she was younger in the 60s, and he was not at all what he said he was. He was a moondog. He was a worm himself. But that eventually leads to how Ted's dad meets Ted's mom, and why the music teacher has a grudge against Ted's mom. And so Bill and Ted try to do something to change the future, so then they don't really have a grudge. She doesn't have that grudge anymore, because you have this whole thing with the hippie stuff and so on and so forth. Peace, make love, peace, not, make love, peace, not war. They're doing protests at school about how they want something other than the food that they're given, so on and so forth. And Ted's dad, Captain Logan, he's totally just entranced by this woman and fallen for her, but in reality she's just using him, and he eventually realizes that, and it devastates the music teacher lady when she was younger. And then Bill give her some advice like dudes are dumb or something, and babes bounce back, and it's like, okay, that's kind of counterproductive and kind of weird. And yeah, if it sounds as boring, and if it sounds to you like it's boring, it is. It is as boring as it sounds. It's such a boring filler episode. The most enjoyment and you'll get out of this episode is in the opening, when you get a cat fight between Ted's mom and the music teacher. That's really that's the closest you'll get. And then they did this weird thing that I don't like with shows or movies, where they have the same actors who are playing a particular role in the show play the younger versions of themselves. Like, that doesn't work, especially if your actors are like 30, 40 years old. It just comes across as if they're just playing dress up, and it's not believable. So, like Ted's dad, you have the actor's not bad. I don't think he's really, Matt Landers isn't a bad actor, but I don't buy him. You put a wig on him and a tie-dye shirt and a fucking vest on him, and have him act all hip and shit and cool, daddy-o, and dude, whoa, I'm a hippie man. It's not believable in the slightest. It just looks like he's going to a Halloween party. Then you have episode 7, stand-up guy Artie Johnson. He does a great job as Einstein. He's a fairly well-known comedian and actor. But you can tell that this is an episode that the writers just were running out of ideas. They didn't know what to do. What are we going to do with Einstein? What if Einstein doesn't want to be a nuclear physicist? He wants to be a comedian. Right? Maybe that'll work. And it doesn't. And the whole thing is situated around how Bill and Ted don't like being embarrassed and made a spectacle of in math class because they don't know the answers to things. And so they go and try to contact Einstein because they don't even know who Einstein is. So they don't know why people are calling them Einstein. And they don't know that that's a derogatory thing. And they go in time and talk to Einstein. Einstein's having a hard time figuring out his theory of relativity. And it was Bill and Ted that find a way to get him to realize that he's supposed to be a nuclear physicist and not a comedian. And then they find a way to get out of this surprise pop quiz predicament at their in their class by explaining the theory of relativity in a way that Bill and Ted would. And that was actually some pretty decent writing there. And I find it pretty ironic and kind of crazy that the last lines of dialogue in this show is Bill and Ted saying the end. It's fitting because that was the end of the show, and they actually said the end. I don't know if that was intentional by the writers or not. Like, they knew that this was not going to last. They knew that this was just going to be a one-season deal, and that was it. But if it was unintentional, it's rather fitting. If it was intentional, it's also fitting. Yeah, I don't really know what else to say about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures. There's a few other things I might want to mention. Production and art design, pretty cheap, really lackluster for the most part. The music, other than the opening credits theme, not really that excellent, or doesn't really have a lot of tunes or songs or instrumentals that really are rocking or will make you bang your head or anything. Effects wise, there's a lot of parts where it just uses stock footage from the first two films, or actually the first film really, for the moments when Bill and Ted get in the phone booth and they travel through time. And that's understandable because they got a really low budget. But, you know, it's just one of those shows where you can definitely see the cracks and you can definitely see the cents that are on the screen. Not really the dollars, because it doesn't seem like they really had a lot of dollars to work with. They had a lot of cents, a lot of loose change, maybe enough for, you know, a few phone calls in the phone booth, but not enough really to create a authentic looking show. Yeah, I don't really know what to say about the show, except if you're a fan of Bill and Ted, you're a diehard fan, and you're curious about it, and you always have been curious about it, give it a watch. If you're not, or if it doesn't interest you, I don't really think there's a whole lot to recommend. There's some decent stuff. Like I said, I don't think Evan Richards and Christopher Kennedy do a bad job playing Bill and Ted. And there's some creative, interesting, innovative directions that some of the episodes take in terms of the overall plot of the episodes. But there's really not enough there to be that entertaining consistently, or that enjoyable, or that funny. It's just one of those shows where you put it on and you're like, huh, that was interesting. Somewhat. That was a show. I've seen worse, but I've also seen a lot better. Yeah, that's really honestly the best way to describe the show. It's not the worst thing ever, but it's not particularly that great either. It's definitely not excellent. It's more like Bill and Ted's below average to mediocre adventures. That's really honestly what this show is. Could have been more. Could have been maybe a little bit better with better writing. Maybe with the involvement of Alex Winter, or maybe the original writers. But as it is, it's just there. It's one of those shows like you watch it and you're just like, Anyway, thanks for watching my review of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures, the 1992 live-action show. And as always, I'll see you later. See ya.
Part of the summer season on Fox. And also coming this summer, two dudes who made history with their first two major motion pictures. Now, Bill and Ted are coming to television in a weekly series of bodacious adventures.
I don't know who you are, but you too will die.
Will not.
Will too.
They've been given the awesome ability to travel to the past.
Ted, give him Mark Zorro. Excellent.
To witness the events that changed our world.
We're going to Woodstock. Yeah, dude. With my dad.
And to reach out and touch great warriors.
Good luck, King Arthur, dude.
Famous scientists.
Check out his hair. Wicked deal.
Legendary ladies' men.
Yes, no. We're about to party with the love god.
And even kings.
Your left, dude, your left.
With a whole world at their fingertips, these two dudes will make history come alive. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures, coming soon. The summer season on Fox, where the new stuff never stops. For all new episodes of your favorite shows and original exciting news series, the one place to turn this summer is Fox, where the new stuff never stops. Before Wayne and Garth, there was Bill and Ted. And now they're getting their own series on Fox.
Excellent!
Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures premieres June 28th.
Before Wayne and Garth, there was Bill and Ted. And now they're getting their own series on Fox.
Excellent!
They'll meet up with great warriors,
Good luck, King Arthur, dude!
famous scientists,
Check out his hair. Wicked dude.
and even kings.
Your left, dude, your left!
Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures series premiere next Sunday. Bill and Ted, the series, premieres next Sunday on Fox.
Excellent!
When Bill and Ted's boss travels back to Camelot, he's mistaken for King Arthur. Come on, guys, park it, really. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures, Sunday, tonight at 7. Bill and Ted have always had a dream to taste the thrill of stardom. So tonight, they'll travel inside the tube
How's it going?
to learn the ropes in the daytime soaps.
I feel pretty.
And all new Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures. Then, is Terry too cool to celebrate Black History Month?
Hey, I make Black History every month.
True Colors at its new time following Bill and Ted tonight. Bill and Ted go inside the tube
How's it going?
to make it big in daytime soaps.
I feel pretty.
And all new Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures Sunday. Bill and Ted go back in time
You my guardian angels?
to introduce a music legend to his destiny.
Your left, dude, your left!
And all new Bill and Ted Sunday. Bill and Ted are relatively stupid, so they're going back in time to learn from Albert Einstein
Dude looks like he just woke up.
on an all new Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures Sunday.